Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. And this book is also, it's connected to all of my research. It's also connected to my teaching. So any of you who have taken my Gender in the Built Environment class, anybody who will take it in the future, that's actually who this book is dedicated to. It's to all the students who've been working with me to think about gender and the built environment. So I'm going to start by making a big claim, which is that every part of the built and designed environment, from furniture to buildings to cities to landscapes, has to do with gender. And the reason why is because all of those things are built and designed by humans for humans to fit us, to communicate to us, to serve us. And gender is one of those essential categories that we use for making sense of ourselves as humans and for organizing ourselves as humans. It doesn't mean it's always equally important, but it's always going to be there, right? So I wrote this book to help us to explore both how gender shapes the built environment and also why it matters to ask this question. So in the book, I look at gender in the built environment through 4 different lenses: through who shapes space, through single gender spaces, through mixed gender spaces, and through queer spaces. And through all of this, I argue that to really understand gender in the built environment, we can't just look at the buildings or the things themselves. We need to see them in the context of how they're used, how they're furnished, how they're remade, how they're understood. And these questions require a broad range of methods, right? So that's the other thing that this book is about what are the questions we ask, what are the methods we can use to begin to work with these. So what I've got for you today is kind of a little review of the book, using some examples that are using each of these lenses. Sorry, get this. There we go. So as I said, one way to explore gender in the built environment is to look at who's doing the designing, who's doing the building, who's making decisions about the built environment. This is a really popular approach in the design fields because looking at the accomplishments of women, of queer people, and people of color in the past helps to make space for minoritized designers in the present, right? If we can understand that we're not, like when people say, oh, I don't know any women architects, I don't know any Black planners, we can say, here's this history that we're building on. And in this book, I'm focused on vernacular architecture. So what I mean by that is the everyday, right? It's the buildings where there often isn't a design professional involved, right? And also cultural landscapes where there isn't always, a landscape architect or something involved, right? It's often things that people are building themselves or that are kind of mass-built things. It can include things where they're design professionals too, but it's the everydayness that matters. But even when there isn't a design professional involved, we can still explore who does the building and who makes the decisions about what a building or space is going to be like. So in self-built housing throughout the world, women are often part of the building process, right? And so I have here 2 examples from Nebraska and South Dakota. These are women homesteaders, right? Turns out about 13% of the homesteads were female owned during the period of homesteading with the Homestead Act, right? So here's the Christman sisters with a sod house that they built. And I don't know the name of this woman, right? With her shack, right? Her homestead shack. But, seeing this helps us to question some of our assumptions about men as the builders and men as the decision makers, right? Especially in places where the home is really thought of as the women's domain, women often have a significant say over the design and furnishing of houses, even if they're not building them themselves. So I talk a whole bunch more about that in the book, but I'm just like tiny little bits here, right? Okay, so at a different scale, still thinking about this question of who's making the decisions, we can explore the buildings commissioned by women's organizations, right? So these are women grouped together who are acting as clients. So two examples here. First, I've got the Mormon Ladies Relief Society. And my next one will be the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association, right? So there's not just the YMCA, there also is the women's branch. And both of these groups use their buildings to, in part, to make claims for themselves as actors in the public realm, right? To say we count as part of society. So the Mormon Relief Society presented themselves as businesswomen by building what is essentially a standard commercial building and running a business in it, right? So here we can see their society hall in Salt Lake City, right? It's got the meeting space above and a shop below that they're running. And it's very similar to these sort of standard, right? It's basically a standard downtown business building for a town of this era, right? In the second half of the 19th century, right? Shops below, offices or meeting halls above, right? The nice top with their name, right? So they're proclaiming their presence in public. Now in 1921, the male church leadership pushed back against the kind of independence that these women were expressing in buildings like this and declared that Women's Relief Society meetings should be held in the local ward meeting house, space that men controlled, rather than in independent buildings. So let's look at a couple of YWCAs. You may recognize this one from the cover of my book. Right, so this is in a YWCA in Binghamton, New York, in upstate New York. And this is a YWCA in Dayton, Ohio. And these two actually make somewhat different kinds of claims, right? They're both making a claim to respectability, right? And to sort of the presence and importance of this women's organization. But the Binghamton YWCA is reusing an existing grand house, right? And this is very common for early YWCAs and for settlement houses, and later for all different, right? It's often cheaper to buy a house in a neighborhood that's gone downhill a bit and fix it up fancy, right, than to build something new, right? So when they're doing that, they're reinforcing the relationship with the private realm and the domestic realm, right? They're saying, you know, we may be here in public, but see, we're also still domestic, right? We're trying to in a house. And then somewhat later, YWCA purpose-built for Dayton is making a different kind of claim, right? It's making a claim for the YWCA and its users, including young working women who would live in the essentially kind of dorm rooms, right, apartments within this, as part of the civic realm, right, as fully part of the public downtown of the city. And we can think about this as being even more important for the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA in Washington, D.C., which I think is the first purpose-built Black YWCA, right? And it's very much announcing we are a respectable, permanent, brick-built, right? Powerful group of women who should be respected as members of this society. All right, so that's a bit about thinking about the people who are making decisions and who are doing the building. So a second approach is to focus on single gender spaces. YWCAs are one of those. So it's a space that's built for just one gender, and it's usually for a more narrowly defined group of people within that gender, right? It's usually people of a certain class, people of a certain race, right? Sort of much more sort of tightly fit. But focusing in on a space that's for just one gender can help us really zone in on how gender is being expressed in the built environment, right? Because if we're like, this is a space for men only, it's expressing masculinity in some way. This is a space for women only, it's expressing femininity in some way. So in this chapter, I look at a whole bunch of different spaces, including library reading rooms, Masonic halls, YMCAs, right, where men are trying to sort of make spaces to make young men of different classes in different YMCAs, and also summer camp bathrooms. But the example that I'm going to talk about today is college dormitories. So here we've got, these are from 3 different schools, right? A girls' dormitory from Idaho. Men's dormitory, I think this one's from Yale. And this is from the Missouri. This is a first floor of a women's dormitory, right? Or a view of a first floor of a women's dormitory, right? So when planners and designers have figured out how to do a dorm for men and for women, they choose to build them in different kinds of ways. So the dorms that are designed for women usually have a single entrance and shared entertaining spaces on the first floor. That's why I only have one here, because there is no first floor space like this, right, in that men's dorm. And so dorms for men more often have, as we can see here, multiple entrances and many fewer public spaces, right? The idea being that if the men kind of both can go out in public and the women can be, and they can also in a co-ed school, go into the spaces that the women are controlling, right, as social spaces. So upstairs, right, in the actual dorm space, women students are typically in single rooms along corridors. So this is a plan from the University of Chicago, right? You can see this is actually sort of built at different moments. Right, here's one entryway, and then you've got this whole row of single rooms along the corridor, right, connected to that one entrance. In comparison, male ones often are grouped around a staircase, right? So we have multiple entrances with multiple staircases. Right here with this entry, got 2 suites connected to each staircase, right? And this tells us several things about how male and female students are being thought about by the people in the schools who are making the decisions about building these, by the dean of students, by the parents that they're trying to, who are willing to let their little darlings go off and live in these dorms, right? In part, women are thought to need more privacy and more security, right? They're more likely to have those single rooms with much more privacy and to have sort of fewer ways for people to get in. And dorms facilitate controlling women's movement into and out of their dorm rooms, right? If you're all going through that one door that we saw in the University of Idaho, you can have a guard on that door and they can know whether you broke curfew. You know, this dorm, nobody's enforcing curfew. Who can enforce curfew in that? Right? You've got multiple doors. Everybody can kind of go in and out whenever they want, right? Men have much more freedom built into these buildings than women do, right? And those public rooms on the first floor of the women's dorms allow women students to have guests without bringing them up to their rooms. But they also reinforce the idea that part of what young women are learning in college is how to be hostesses, right? That they will host parties in that space. We can see that, or haven't been in them all, but when I walk down past the sororities, you can feel that same kind of feeling, right? The first floor of the sororities usually has a sort of very nice kind of parlor space, beautifully decorated for that kind of social hosting. I have not been into the fraternities up here, but I doubt very much that they have a equivalent kind of space, right, within them. All right. Now, so these single gender spaces can tell us a whole lot, but they're also limited because they're really rare. most of the spaces that we spend time in are mixed gender, right? We share workplaces, we share classrooms, we share streets, we share shops, we share restaurants, theaters, and often our homes with people who have different gender identities than our own, right? It is entirely possible that the only time in somebody's life when they're going to be staying in a place that is sleeping and living in a place that's single gender is when they're in their dorm, right? If you're in a place with gender segregated dorms, right? So if we think about workplaces, they've very long had a mix of people within them, right? If we look at medieval workplaces, there's men and women working in them, right? It's not like completely segregated space, but often the roles have been defined by gender and by class and race, right? Who does what and where you are within that space. So for example, secretaries and administrative assistants are still over 92% female, according to the most recent federal statistics I could find. And the office spaces where they've worked have typically facilitated close supervision, and historically with very little opportunity for personalization, right? So we can see in these two 1940s and 1950s workplaces, right? There are managers, male managers here. This is mail sorting in New Zealand, or the male managers standing up and watching over as the women are working their desks, right? Or similarly here, we become potentially a female manager, but there's still the same kind of being watched, right, as a basic piece of it. And certainly historically, right, there is nothing that tells you who is at which desk, right? Those desks are clear, clean, no kind of personalization. But in the same time period, male managers have access to privacy and to personalization, right? So it's common still for CEOs to get some money to be able to personalize their office when they take over, right, at an institution, right? We have these offices that are almost like a whole little house, right, on their own. This is a plan from 1966 for an office, and I just wanted to have you notice how every office is accessed by way of a secretary, right? So the secretaries are policing the access, right? They've got this privacy that the secretary is helping to control, right? The secretary has much less privacy, right? And we can see that upstairs in the dean suite, for example, right? Is that same kind of process, right? Who has more privacy? That tends to be a gendered structure. Not always, but as I said, 92% of secretaries and administrative assistants are female. I don't know the statistics on CEOs, but you know, right, we're still pretty much in that kind of space. All right, so let's also look at houses, because houses are a really, really fruitful place for looking at gender, because gender is an essential aspect of how we organize family, right? Family is, you know, that's where you're a child and you're learning what it is to be gendered, right? And your parents are modeling for you what it is to be gendered, right? We tend to organize families around gender. So we can look at a plan and begin to see things about the organization of families. So got master bedrooms, right? There's a hierarchy that's built in. And how hierarchical it is varies. It's become more so. This is from 1954, I think. Right here, we can see there is one bedroom that's a little bigger and has a private bath with shower, which is masculine, versus the tub, which is feminine and children. But that's a whole other thing. Right, and separation between like the private and the public, and the kitchen is connected to all these spaces, and I'll talk more about the kitchen in a minute. This is a contemporary plan up Route 29. This is a standardized house you can get up there. Right, what I want you to notice is, you know, the master bedroom has grown. The master bedroom has and all these other kind of attachments that help separate it from the rest of the house. And we can also see something that we already see beginning in some of these earlier plans as well, the separation between children's space, guest space over there, bedrooms 2 and 3, and the adult space, right? Have that kind of separation. All right. So the other thing, and here's one from 1956 that does have some of that separation. So here's the parents' bedroom with their private bath, and then the children's bedrooms over here with a family room and shared or split bedroom. One of the things we see in modernist houses in the 1950s and 1960s is that suburban houses and houses in general are increasingly organized around the care of children, right? Houses exist for taking care of children, right? As a kind of major plan, even though, no, it might only be 17 to 25 years of the time you're in that house when there are any kids, right? There's a bunch of time that's not that as well. And so one of the important pieces of this is this kitchen, right? So an open galley kitchen, right? So we can see one here. This is the kitchen, right? That can serve the dining room and serve the family room. What this is from the 1956 Women's Congress on Housing. Basically the federal government brought in women from across the country to say, what do they want in a house, right? And this is a conceptual one. But what I wanted to notice is here's the kitchen. It's the center, right? The areas watch children, right? In these different kinds of different directions. Right. The participants in this argued that the kitchen was the most important room in the house, both in function and location, the heart, the core, the center, the focal point, the pivotal point. And that's a quotation from the report of the house. And it's where you can, watch children playing. And it's also a place where, of course, you're working, you're laboring, you're cooking, you're taking care of the family. And the importance of the kitchen as this female space of work and service is highlighted in advertisements of this time period, which show women standing in their kitchens. I have not found a single advertisement that shows a woman sitting in a kitchen. She is always standing. And if there are other members of the family there, she's often serving them. Right. And advertisements for all, like this is an advertisement for kitchen. This is an advertisement for flooring. They're advertisements for anything you might imagine for a house, except for a bed, they will use an image of a kitchen for. And the woman will always be standing in it and often serving in it as well. Right. So, right, part of this, we can see how houses express what people imagine a family to be at a particular moment, and what the roles are of the different family members at that time, right? And the standard houses express a dominant heteronormative family structure. Master bedroom for the parents, this is distinguished from these smaller and more separated room for children, right? It's about a family with children, and that's what they're built for. But when queer households have been able to shape their own house plans, they're often quite different. So these two plans are, this is the Weston Havens House in Berkeley, California from 1941, and the Anthony Dongia House on Fire Island from 1972. So what I want you to notice in these is, Tabby Summers, who graduated last year, did a bunch of these drawings for me, so the highlighting and stuff is hers. Is that this house, right? So this is the upper floor, this is the lower floor, has 3 complete bedroom suites. 3 things we might think of as master bedrooms, right? They've got the beds, they've got the private full bath, they've even got their own terraces on this level. This one has access to this terrace that goes around, right? Private bathroom, right? And so you can't tell which is the master bedroom. They all are. Right. And similarly, this house on Fire Island, we know it's, the house on Fire Island is for vacationing on Fire Island. beach that way. Right? Walkway this way, but notice, right, we have 3 equivalent bedrooms. There isn't a hierarchy within those bedrooms, right? They're doing the same thing, right? This is not, neither of these are houses that are predicated on the idea of children, right? Or even on the idea of couples necessarily, right? You could be living in them in various ways, these non-hierarchical bedrooms. Now, of course, more often, these are people who have money and can hire architects, right, to be able to design their houses. More often, queer households, like most other households, have to transform spaces through patterns of inhabitation, right? You have a house, it might have been designed for a family that's very different from yours, and you just have to figure out, okay, how do we live in this, right? How do we live in this space, right? And households that expand and contract to contain families of choice, kitchens that can serve, and other spaces that serve as spaces of political organizing, as well as places for family meals. And decorations that express queer identities can all remake the gendered meanings of a house, right? So we're seeing here my neighbor's decoration, so I can use that from her, queer suburban household. And this is a photograph of I can't think of her name. Nestle is her last name. But this is her apartment, which is simultaneously the headquarters of the Lesbian Herstory Archives, right? So it is her apartment. It is also an archive of lesbian history. It is also, at this point, a place where they're socializing in the context of one of the first meetings about lesbian politics, sort of academic meetings about lesbian politics, right? And so it's being transformed by the way it's being used, it's being transformed by the imagery, right, that's being used, the decorations being used within it, right? It's being not just a house, but a house at an archive, right? All of those things are transforming, are queering this apartment without necessarily changing anything physically about it, right? So I argue in part that respecting inhabitation as placemaking is central to taking gender seriously. And it's not only central to gender, right? When we look at any community only by looking at the neighborhoods in which they're sort of enclaves, right? We're missing, what does it mean? How can we understand Black space from a Black family who may be living in the same apartment building, right? And inhabiting it in their way. How can we understand Latino space as ways of living in spaces that were not necessarily built for the family that is living in it, but is being inhabited in a particular kind of way, right? That is expressing their identity, right? And furnishing and decorating transform the meaning of a place, right? They remind the people who live there who they are, and they also communicate to outsiders who lives here, who is the person who you're encountering here. So to study gender well, we need to pay attention not just to the ways that gendered ideologies are built into a space, like we were seeing in those dormitories, seeing in those standard 1950s houses, but also how people live in it, decorate it, and think about it changes what it means. So part of what I do in this book is discuss many of the methods that can help us get at all the ways that the built environment is gendered. We can interview, we can observe, we can read novels and memoirs, we can look at snapshots, this one, and advertisements and films. We can find traces of use in buildings and their surroundings. Archaeologists are really great at that traces of use thing. And the more methods that we use to ask and answer questions about the gendering of the built environment, the better we can understand how the world all around us communicates to us and shapes us, and how we can participate in remaking it to better fit everyone. Thank you.